Thank you, first of all, for having me here and for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in the company of such excellent colleagues and from all around the world eventually. So that's really nice. What I would like to talk to you about today is sort of first preliminary research done in the context of my ERC project called Craftwork, which focuses on the new forms of craft and artisanal work and their specific question around the relationship between identity and work, which is funded by an ERC starting grant, as I said, and this particular talk actually focuses on the relationship between this particular new form of work, which we are about to see in greater detail in a moment, and digital platforms, which are not just because something is, say, technically taking place on the digital, are still very, very important actors, even in a context that might look a little bit distant from it. And we are trying to understand today why and what is the case with Craftwork and digital platforms. The premise, the starting point of this argumentation is actually dated back to a paper of mine going back a few years now on a sort of critical rereading of the notion of digital labor, which has undergone different types of understandings and discussions over the last couple of decades since its introduction, and its also affirmation as an important way for critically addressing the relationship between digital media and work, and also taking that into the newer forms of platform labor, which we have discussed also this morning from the likes of Uber and Deliveroo. And in that paper, I essentially developed this table, which is what sociologists do, tables, to try and make a more sort of carefully specific argument as to the distinguishing features of platform labor, as opposed to the antecedents, the theoretical antecedents of it. So both digital labor as mainly, although not exclusively, theorized by Christian Fuchs, and its even older antecedent of audience labor and the critical Marxist scholarship that developed throughout these concepts and cognate ideas of free labor and labor, or venture labor, and essentially trying to carve out what is specific to platform labor vis-a-vis this theoretical tradition. And of course, you can see on the screen or read the paper if you like, in that sense, to single this out, and especially the role of platforms, of course, as what I describe as points of production, where there is an important role that the infrastructural nature of the platform does, essentially, not just in bringing together supply and demand of work, consumers and clients, whatever we come from to analyze this, but also in relation to the social relations of production, so a process of remediation of the social relations in the context of labor that is wider and deeper, and that the platform offers essentially an object and the model for that to do. Springing out from this discussion, from this argumentation, I now want to evolve and complicate this a little bit further, trying to, in part, differentiate within the idea of platform labor as to the different types of platform labor that, by that piece of research, which of course was published in 2021, which means was also potentially dating a couple of years earlier in the making, and that now have come to show the different facets of specific forms of platform labor. And here I know I'm cheesy with this comment, but I know that Brooke and Thomas Poel and David Niebuhr's work on the platformization of cultural production has been instrumental in many of these conversation and getting to this tripartition. So essentially, the idea is that when we look at these forms of work, we've sort of come to visualize three main ones, which concern the first one, platform-based work, so where the platform organizes and oversees the capital-labor relation, and this is the gig economy eventually that we've discussed also this morning when it comes to Uber and Deliveroo, where the platform takes an active role in directing workers to do what they have to do. Then we have platform-dependent work, what may be defined as platform-dependent work. Sorry for the mismatch in the slide. I mean, it's a PowerPoint issue, which goes to, I guess, what Brooke will talk about, or maybe not, but she has definitely extensively researched this over the years. Content creators, essentially individuals whose platform activity constitutes an essential component of work, but their tasks are not directly organized or overseen or monitored and essentially algorithmically managed in a direct way by the platform itself. And then there is this whole big sort of gray area in between, which may be called platformized work, in which platforms have growingly become relevant and important, despite not necessarily being the work taking place, despite not necessarily it being enabled by or undertaken through a platform. But the platform serves the role of repurposing, at least in part, if not in full, the social relations of production in a certain context and kind of taking that way of working in a new direction. And this is the case of the artisanal economy, or as Chris Land and others have started to call it, neo-craft work. So briefly, but importantly, a definition of neo-craft work that I use here is taken directly from the work of Chris Land, and essentially consists of professions, jobs of different kinds that have at their core the recuperation of old and sometimes pre-industrial forms of production and their adaptation to the post-industrial economy, essentially. This neo stands both for a sort of new twist of the new craft and artisanal work, but also neo as in neoliberal, which is core to the repositioning of these activities into the modern economy. And the key feature of neo-craft work, which is quintessentially epitomized by craft beer brewing, is the idea of a less alienated form of work in which authenticity is a central conception, a cultural conception of value, the source of meaning in work, and where, of course, on the consumer side, there is a growing interest for particularity, again, to use a word from the consumer culture theory world, the particular, as argued by Jennifer Smith Maguire, which becomes a status-producing dimension, and something that is particularly appealing, as the main reference in this context argues, so Richard Oseo's work, for young middle-class workers who end up often doing what may be otherwise described as or would be otherwise described as a working class job, and re-signify it to a cool status, let's put it like this. And of course, the emergence of these neo-craft professions, neo-craft work, should be located in the context of hipster culture. This is part of a different paper. I don't want to sort of take any more time than necessary to discuss this here, but I'm happy to do that, especially if you have 6 or 7 hours. We don't, so I'm stopping here. But it the point here is that this is, for me and for the sort of scope of the project, this represents a kind of counter movement to the neoliberal labor market, where meaningfulness in work has diminished over the years, and also potentially epitomized by the reference to bullshit jobs by David Graeber, which of course takes this to a somewhat extreme level. Within this context, of course, social media and digital platforms in general are key to this resignification of manual and what would otherwise consider traditionally low-skilled work into status-inducing occupations through what Alessandro Gerosa and I describe as a process of discursive materiality, so a new kind of embroidering of discursive meanings and material practices which are sort of sublimated into the production of things like artisanal coffee, craft beer, and not just food, of course, but also neo-craft forms of production in the context of accessories, beauty products, and jewelry, and so on and so forth. again, so this is just to give you an idea of the variety of products that and industries that we are talking about here, which we should see on a continuum essentially between sort of more traditional craft professions like ceramicists or bookbinders up to more sort of service economy traditional professions like bartender, mixologists, bartenders, who re-signify their work, their service work into somewhat of an artistic labor. So the argument that I'm bringing forward for discussion today is the idea of seeing neocraft work as a kind of epitomous example of platformized craft work, essentially, where social relations of productions are repurposed by way of platform intermediation in part or in full, despite, of course, this kind of work is not necessarily done or enabled by or undertaken through a digital platform. And this, for the analysis that we've been doing so far with my postdoctoral researchers that helped me throughout the process, this occurs at 4 levels for what we have seen right now. The level of practices, so that increasingly social media work is perceived to be part and parcel of the new way of doing craft work. So curating a social media presence and being somewhat of a content creator is considered part of the artisanal work that they are doing, which is quite interesting. Then, of course, at the level of the aesthetics, which nods again to the hipster world, and the idea of a somewhat coherent or more or less mainstreaming aesthetic canon that is through which these types of products should be presented to the general public, and that of course these workers strive to reproduce in the form of the sort of Instagram driven aesthetics. Then, of course, there is also an element of demand and supply, whereby neocraft workers increasingly get clients through social media, directly contacted by clients to produce their products through a social media platform. Instagram is where this happens the most, of course, but it's not the only context in which this happens. And of course, there is a set of ethics, as meaning the ethos of self-presentation that this involves, because of course for many of these people eventually, for instance, even a craft sort of quintessential craft platform such as Etsy becomes something that they want to distinguish from, because Etsy, and I'll probably elaborate that a little bit more later, Etsy, people who are on Etsy are considered as hobbyists, while neocraft workers do not use necessarily Etsy as a platform and prefer traditional social media or new ones such as TikTok to perform their self-presentation strategies. Again, just to expand a little bit on that, the level of practices engages, for instance, a notion of guesswork for algorithmic imaginaries. So, of course, the role that algorithms play in making sure that certain content circulates more or less, and a dependency of ranking and processes of platform negotiations, including also suffering from fatigue, because many of these workers are not necessarily trained or have studied for this type of work. So many are unwilling or reluctant to use them and feel they're not trained enough. And on an aesthetic level, there is a tension towards adhering to this broad craft imaginary, which is argued to be distinctive of this kind of job. And of course, the presentation of the performance of one's work into Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok in particular is essential, and that amounts to what may be described as a culturalization of otherwise material and sometimes very labor-intensive work, meaning that it becomes a pseudo sort of cultural labor in that sense. And to adhere to the idea, to the dogmatic norm of authenticity that permeates social media cultures. In terms of demand and supply, this is interesting because it brings craft into a new sort of relationship between with neocraft work when it comes to craft and technology. neo-craft workers are not, as opposed to many traditional craft workers, are not necessarily against technology. So the fact that social media are so relevant for their work means that they do not consider themselves as anti-technological. And also, as I said, in this sense, they develop their own sort of platform-specific understandings, which I summed up in the contentious and odd sentence which we heard from a participant: Etsy is for boys, Instagram is for men, which of course is, I put it there just because it sparks some discussion. Sometimes we all know the gender dimension that all of these entail. But the idea is that Etsy is considered for a platform that is adequate for people, as I mentioned before, for people who do not engage this on a professional level. While if you do want to do this professionally, and the way in which you present your work professionally as a credible neo-craft worker goes through Instagram first and foremost, and of course to the whole self-branding practices that this entails. How we got to these profiles, I'll briefly describe our research process. We mapped these neo-craft workers via digital methods because it was impossible to do this via traditional statistics. Sorry, I'm coming back to this in a moment. From 6 platforms, essentially by a large-scale data collection combined with a more small-scale ethnographic content analysis, we have extracted so far 365 cases across the EU area. And now we are interviewing these workers in their own place of work to try and understand much more of what we currently know about their daily, everyday work experiences and all the sort of surrounding issues, part of which we have discussed also today. Very briefly, this is a breakdown of the industries in which our research has been able to observe. So we have, of course, a prominence of food, but you can see there's a lot more than just food, especially in terms of accessories and clothes, and a prominence of Instagram and Facebook for now. Then we're still processing Twitter data, so this is not exactly super up to date as a table, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. And this is the country distribution. The project is based in the context of the EU, so you see that there is still a quite wide variety of countries involved, and only a handful of EU countries have not appeared in our radar, which is also quite interesting. And to some extent also quite meaningful in relation to the fact that France and Italy have a long tradition of artisanal work, and especially Ireland is the place where craft beer was invented eventually as such. So, you know, it's not necessarily something terribly surprising, but probably the fact that we found it this way makes it quite new. We've seen this again, so probably I'm just going to skip this quite quickly through the end, only to show you a few of these examples. This is an artisanal coffee roastery in Milan, and again, you can see in the way in which social media is used, in this case Instagram, although they don't have that terribly big amount of followers. It's basically a content creator like kind of online presence, and if you, this is a particularly interesting case for a number of reasons, including the fact that it is part of what they do is to see themselves as a startup company. So with very much the ethos of a startup, alongside coffee, they develop also digital products such as a platform to connect themselves and other related products to restaurateurs. So again, a very unique example. This is a bookbinder in Copenhagen that I've had the chance to interview. And again, you can see the sort of very well curated social media picture, and she again in the interview talks a lot about how she gets jobs from her Instagram presence and the key role that this plays, although she is the reluctant in many ways case that I mentioned before, and the fact that she doesn't really want to do it, but she has no other way, and she has to. And this is finally another interviewee of ours. It's a Swedish sewing company in Malmö, where there's again a very low number of followers, but it is directly connected to a brand, to a fashion brand, Maner, which you can see also in the screen. And there's and of course this is a sort of completely sort of semi-digital craft work where there's a sewing area, and then there's a digital area in the same premises where the job is taken, and you can see the clear sort of curation of the online presence of this company as a peculiar example of many of the things that we were talking about before. As a final conclusion, or non-conclusion, because the research is still ongoing, of course, we are still asking ourselves a lot of things. For instance, this process of resignification of platformization of neocraft work, we are wondering the extent to which is cross-platform or platform-specific. Again, Brooke Duffy, thank you for that, to the ways in which we are seeing. So if actually Instagram and TikTok bring with them platform-specific aesthetic and discourse, and whether this platformized labor is perceived as such by these workers. The idea so far is that this is the case, but we want to interview more and from them also to obtain more information about what is the relationship between what they're doing and traditional creative work. Because of course, it seems that this type of work has essentially subsumed what early 2000s creative labor was for the labor market. So the attempt at trying to find work that was meaningful as opposed to, you know, the drudgery of alternative forms of labor that are less meaningful on a personal and passionate level. And of course, to what extent our neocraft workers are able to negotiate their position vis-a-vis platforms and exert some agency. I think I'll stop here. I hope I have not been too long, probably a bit too long, but nobody stopped me. And, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.